Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second webinar in the series of requirements engineering about requirements analysis. My name is Jose Muñoz, and I'm currently working as a consultant in Visure Requirements. In the past years, I have been gathering experience in different projects as a system analyst and also system engineer, and finally conducting also trainings about the requirement. We'll be sharing in this webinar series those experience and good practices when working with requirement. Today, as you may know, is our second webinar in this series. We will be recapping the concepts already learned in the first webinar about requirements engineering and its first activity, the requirements elicitation. Okay, for those that were in that first webinar, it has been recorded and it's already published in our YouTube channel, so you can access to that webinar. And in the same way, we will be recording this very webinar and we'll be uploading that afterward. After recapping those concepts from the previous webinar, we will be moving forward in the requirements engineering activities and learn the basis of requirements analysis and also a bit about the requirement specification. Okay, I will be explaining that afterward during the webinar agenda. But before starting with all of that, please allow me to explain a bit about the GoToWebinar interface for those that aren't familiar with it. First of all, as you may already notice, all of you are mute. So if you have any question, anything you want to ask or to a point, please feel free to use the questioning tab that you have in the GoToWebinar interface. Okay, you may have a tab panel in the right part of your screen where you can use the question section in order to pose questions. At the end of the webinar, we will have time for the question and answer section, and I will be answering all those questions that may arise, that you may have. Also, as I was mentioning before, I will be recording the webinar, not the question and answer section, but the rest of the webinar, so we can post it online afterward. Okay, so that's everything about the logistic of the webinar. Let's start with our webinar agenda, with today's agenda. Okay. As you can see here, our first point for today is going to be just explaining a bit about Visure Solution, our company. I promise it's going to be really fast, just one slide in order to just locate the company and just explain a bit about it. But yes, one slide is going to be really fast, really quick. The main target for today is the rest of the points in the agenda. We will be just, as I mentioned, recapping the lessons that we have already learned in the first chapter in the series about requirements engineering, and also about the first activity in the requirements engineering process, which will be requirements elicitation. We will be just refreshing that a bit. And after that, we will be just continue with the requirements engineering process and explain about the requirements analysis. Okay. In this section, we also be discussing a bit about requirements modeling, because probably it's one of the most common techniques using during the analysis step. Okay, the modeling is using others in other activities, but we will be explaining that during the requirements analysis. After that, although the title of the webinar is requirements analysis, I will be covering a bit of the requirement specification in this webinar. The reason for that is that probably, we can have more than 1 hour, of course, of webinar about requirements analysis, especially if we just explain a bit about the requirements modeling. But I don't want to go too much in detail in each of the activities. So we will be just covering a bit about requirements analysis, and that will left us with enough time, will leave us with enough time for also covering a bit about the requirement specification. Of course, not all of it, not all of everything that is inside the requirement specification, because that is going to be another webinar in this series. The chapter 3 is going to be about the requirements specification, but a bit about the requirement specification will be covered today. And finally, we will have a summary and a question and answer section at the end of the webinar, as I was mentioning before. So with all this in mind, let's start with today's webinar. And the first point in the agenda, as you can see here, is the company Visure solution. As I promised, just one slide. I will be very fast, and I will be just jumping to the main topics after this. Requirements, Visure Solution, it's the requirements company, is a company specialized in the requirements engineering for both system engineering companies and software engineering companies. Okay, we pick the best of both worlds and implement that into our tool because we are manufacturers and distributors of Visure Requirements, our leading requirement solution. Funny thing, you may be asking if you are a manufacturer and distributor of a requirements tool, why there is nothing in the agenda about that very tool, that same tool. Well, we will be covering something about tools, but not in today's webinar. Not also, we neither cover that in the first series, in the first chapter, because for elicitation and for analysis, I want just to be as tool-free as possible. When we enter in the specification and the management of requirements and so on in different stages, different activities, I will be using the tool for supporting that. But in today's webinar, I won't be displaying anything about the tool yet. Okay, I will try to be as tool-free as possible. Anyway, we are, as I was mentioning, distributors and manufacturers of a leading requirement solution. And also we offer services and consultancy and training all around requirements. Okay. Our headquarters are located in San Francisco in the United States of America, and we have got also an office in the UK, Spain, and Germany. As you can see, we are ISO SPICE and IREP certified. Not just IREP certified, but we also offer the possibility of training for people that are preparing the IREP certification. Okay, and as I mentioned, I don't want to spend too much time talking about the company, so that was all about Visure Solution. Okay, from now on, let's focus on the main topic of the webinar, that is going to be requirements analysis and a bit of a specification. But before that, just let's recap, let's refresh a bit about the lessons that we have already learned, or as the TV series used to say, previously on this series, previously on these chapters, what we have seen. Okay, so in the previous webinar, we talked about requirements engineering, and we just define the requirements engineering as a set of activities. The word activity is important in here. They are not stages. They are activities because we can just go backward and forward easily. It's not that we just perform the elicitation and then jump to the analysis and just forget about the elicitation. We will be moving backward and forward when working with the requirement. We elicitate requirement, we go to the analysis phase, maybe we discover something in there and we go back to the elicitation again, then we start documenting, then we need to analysis again, and so on and so on. So it's not just a waterfall process, but it's more like a spiral. We go back and forward easily. Okay, so as I was saying, it's a set of activities concerned with identifying and communicating the purpose of a system or software and the context in which it will be used. Therefore, requirements engineering acts as a bridge between the real-world needs of users or customers and other constituencies affected by a software system and the capabilities and opportunities afforded by the system of software-intensive technologies. Okay, this is the definition that we use for the requirements engineering in our last session. Okay, we also said about the requirements engineering, or about specifically the first activity, that it's going to be mainly about separating, or it's an important thing is going to be separating the problem and the solution. Okay, it's easily common to it's really common to misunderstood these two concepts, and when we write requirement, we start specifying the solution, we start saying how we are going to implement that solution, and that's not what the requirements are about. Depending on the level of the requirement we are talking about, we have to focus on the problem, we have to focus on the solution. Okay, that is something that we mentioned in the past webinar. And also the important thing I was mentioning is that the activities that are inside the requirements engineering, those 4 activities listed in here, the elicitation, the analysis, the documentation, and the validation, are activities, not stages, meaning that, as I mentioned before, I will be moving backward and forward easily. It's not that I finish elicitation and start analyzing, I finish analyzing and start documenting, and then validating, and that's all. Okay. So we discovered these 4 activities, and then we just start talking in the past webinar about the elicitation. We focus in that first activity, which is the process of discovering and reviewing the user needs and constraints for the system. Okay. Regarding that very process, that activity, the elicitation, we discovered that it's problem-oriented and not solution-oriented. It's the elicitation is about discovering the boundaries of the right system to build. This is important because that boundaries are going to be the scope of my system, and that is part of the elicitation, just discovering the scope. Okay, it's collaborative work between the stakeholders and the requirements engineering. Stakeholder is an important word in here because users is not enough. We define what is a stakeholder, basically everyone or everything, because it's not just a person, could be a system that is interested somehow in the success or in the failure of our system. And therefore, it's going to have requirements, or it's going to have something to say about my system or my software. Okay, so stakeholder is an important word in here. It's also about finding the requirement and its sources. It's important to identify the sources and also to trace the requirements with those sources. It's also about making explicit what is implicit, and this is also really tricky when working with the requirements, because usually people just assume things, and that is very risky because they have to be written down. You can assume something, you have to write that down when working with the requirement. And it's going to happen a lot when we're working with users, with the stakeholders, that they are going to say, oh, but you didn't do this. Yeah, of course, because you didn't ask for that. Yeah, I didn't, but it's there. It's somehow it's you have to assume that, no, I'm not going to assume. So it's important that everything is going to be implicit. Okay. And also during the elicitation, we talk about different techniques. There are a lot of techniques, several techniques. When working with the requirements, when eliciting requirement, we have got interviews, which is probably the most common technique. We have got brainstorming, prototyping, use cases. We have got preview. We have got several techniques, questionnaires, and so on and so on. Okay, we just mentioned some of them. We just focus on 2 or 3 of them. Depending on the type of requirement you want to gather, depending on the system you want to build, depending on the users you are working with or the stakeholder you are working with, you have to use one or another techniques. Okay, probably the most common are the interview. You are going to interview almost every time, but there are other techniques that you have to use. Okay, and basically this is what we cover in the past webinar. Okay, in the chapter 1. So let's move forward and let's go to today's webinar. Okay, this was just a lesson learned, previous chapters, let's say. But now let's move to the requirements analysis activity. Okay, what we are going to do today is just first of all, let's locate ourselves. Where are we? Okay, well, this is just a diagram that I have picked from I Am Somerville, which is a guru when talking about requirements, of course. And you can see here that we have got in this diagram the 4 main activities in the requirements engineering: elicitation, analysis, documentation, and validation. And we have got them here And basically what we're going to do with the requirements engineering process is just taking as the entry point the user needs, the domain information, the existing system information, regulations, standards, laws, etc. We're going to use that as our entry point. We are going to elicitate requirements of all those sources. With those requirements that we are going to elicit, we are going to afterward analyze and negotiate those requirements, because also analysis is usually common that it's together with the negotiation of those requirements. Okay, and when we negotiate this, we are going to also after that document those requirements. Here we say documentation, requirements documentation. Requirements specification is another word for that. Both are valid. Okay, and when we start doing that, we are going to finish. We are going to get a requirements document or a system specification that we have to also validate with the users, with the stakeholders. Okay, so we will have the requirements validation also stage here, not stage but activity. And after that, we get an agreed requirement, set of requirements. As you can see, there are arrows everywhere, because basically I can just go backward and forward from the requirements elicitation to the analysis and negotiation, then discover that I have missed something, go back to the elicitation, then go forward again to the analysis, and then start documenting, start saying, and whatever. Okay, so the other day we covered the requirements elicitation, and today we are in the requirements analysis activity. This is one way of putting these activities, as I was mentioning, coming from Ian Somerville, but another one could be this one in this slide. It's also coming from Ian Somerville, but as you can see here, the activity has been rearranged. And for example, and it's interesting because we will be discussing that in a couple of slides, the requirement elicitation has been put together in here with the requirements analysis. The reason for this is because usually those two activities are going by hand. You start gathering requirement, you start eliciting requirement, and at the same time you start analyzing those requirements. Why? Because basically the analysis step, the analysis activity, it's about understanding those requirements that you are gathering, that you are eliciting, and at the same time you are gathering those requirements, you're starting to understand them. Okay, so that's why usually those two activities are together. So in this one in here, in this diagram in here, we see that there is a feasibility study before starting with the requirements engineering, and after that we get the elicitation and analysis step. We get some system models for that. That's fine. That's great. We are going to cover also that, how we can use the modeling techniques in order to better understand the problem, better understand the requirement. And then we can move forward to the requirement specification that is going to produce a user and system requirement, a set of user and system requirements. We will be moving forward and backward from the elicitation analysis and the specification. Regarding user and system requirements, if you remember from the previous webinar, we focus on those two concepts, how the user requirements are more close to the problem, they describe the situation the user needs, and then the system requirements is just a proposed solution for those needs, for those problems that are gathered in the user requirements. Important thing is that it's just a proposed and abstract solution. It shouldn't be a detailed solution that is going to be the design, and it's just, as I mentioned, one of the possible solutions. There could be several system requirements that fit to the same user requirements that are just different solutions that we can present to the users. After that, we can just move forward to the requirements validation, and that will produce finally the requirements document. Okay, so just basically another way for just presenting those 3-4 activities. And finally, another way also coming from Ian Somerville is this one. Okay, I think it's better to display that information in an spiral kind of way, because we are going to be moving backward and forward for each activities. In this case, there are just 3 activities. elicitation, specification, and validation, because the analysis is going to be together with the elicitation. As I mentioned before, they are usually tied together. So we can start by just writing the business requirements specification, which are just really high level, top level requirement regarding the business needs, nothing to do with the system or with the software that we are designing, that we will be designing, sorry. After that, we can perform a feasibility study and then start writing some, or better, start gathering, start eliciting some user requirements that we are going to specify after that. Then we can prototype, then we can write down some system requirements. We can just elicitate them first and then write them down. And finally, got some reviews, got some feedback from that, and finally get a system requirement document. Okay, so this is just another way, a third way, coming from the same author, from Ian Somerby, to just represent the main activities in the requirements engineering process. Okay, so with all this, all I wanted is just locate ourselves. Where are we exactly? We have just covered the requirements elicitation in the previous webinar, and now that we have got a set of requirements, that we have started gathering some requirement, eliciting some requirement, we can analyze those requirements. What do I mean by saying we analyze those requirements? Well, the requirements analysis is going to be the process of studying and understanding, keyword here, understanding the needs of the stakeholders. They could be customers, they could be users, they could be whatever, okay? In view of coming up with a solution, okay? Of course, this will depend on the level of requirements you are writing. If it's the user requirements, we are still really far away from the solution. We are just focusing on the needs, focusing on the problem. But for the system requirements, we are just presenting a proposal for the solution. Okay, so solution that will depend exactly in the level of requirements we are writing down. Such a solution may involve, for example, those are just 3-4 samples here, a new organization of the workflow in the company, a new system or system to be, which will be used in the existing or modified workflow, a new software if we are developing a software, which is to run within the existing computer system or involve modifying the existing hardware, etc. Okay, as you can see, the solution may involve different concepts, different solutions from the requirements analysis. The important thing, as I mentioned before, is that both analysis and elicitation are going to feed each other. They are going to always be together. We start gathering, we start eliciting requirement, and at the same time we start analyzing them. Okay, we start just understanding those requirements at the same time we are just eliciting them. Requirements analysis is also often linked with the modeling. We will be covering that in just a couple of slides, but one of the most common techniques for performing this analysis, for just better understanding those requirements, is going to be the modeling. Okay, usually the people think in the modeling as a technique for the design or for the documentation, but of course it's going to be a technique also for the elicitation and mainly for the analysis of the requirement, because at the end those models are going to help me to better understand the problem and the solution that I'm going to propose. Okay. So what is the main objectives that I'm pursuing, that I'm looking for with the requirements analysis? Well, of course, the first and main objective is not listed in here because it has been said in the previous slide, which is going to be, of course, understanding the user needs and the requirements. Okay, but the rest of the objectives are going to be detect and resolve conflict between the requirements and the users also. Okay, requirements are going to be coming from different sources, different users, different perspectives, different point of views. So depending on the source, there are going to be different requirements, and we may have some conflicts in the requirements. So I have to detect them and resolve in this step when we are analyzing the requirements, because sometimes a user wants this and a different user wants this other thing, and there is no way my system is going to meet both. Okay, so I have to negotiate with those two users, those two stakeholders, in order to get to a solution. Okay. I have to negotiate priorities with the stakeholders, because for certain user, these features are going to be the most important thing in the system, and for these other users, these other features are going to be the most important thing. So I have to just prioritize those requirements, those features based on each stakeholder type, on each stakeholder priorities. With that, I'm going to prioritize those requirements. There are several techniques for performing this prioritization. Okay, we are not going to cover any of them in this webinar, because we can dedicate a completely different webinar for prioritizing the requirements. In fact, okay, there are different cal viewers, matrix, and different techniques that we can use for performing that prioritization. Okay, we are going to elaborate the user and system requirements. This is part of the objectives of the analysis. In order to document then those requirements in the requirement specification document, in order to allow the developers to design and to implement and to test, and so on and so on. We are going to classify the requirements into different subcategories and allocate the requirements into subsystems. Okay. We are going to evaluate for the usable qualities based on the analysis we are going to perform, and also make sure that nothing major is forgotten. And it's important that by forgotten here could be that it's not implicit. So we have to write then everything down. As I mentioned before, if it's not in the requirement specification, then it's not going to be in the system. So it's important that we write down everything, even if it's super clear that it's going to be there, but we have to put it down. We have to write it down. It's not enough with okay, it's explicit in here. No, it's implicit in here. No, we have to put it down. Okay. As I mentioned before, usually the requirement elicitation is mixed with the requirements analysis, but also the requirements analysis is commonly mixed with the requirement specification. Okay, remember, we have mentioned that they are activities, not stages of a waterfall process. So we are going to start gathering the requirement, eliciting those requirements. Then I'm going to start analyzing those requirements. Maybe I go back to the eliciting those requirements and go forward and start specifying the requirement, and then go back and analyze again, and so on and so on. Because those two concepts, or those three concepts, in fact, are really tied together. The analysis is going to be close to the specification, probably closer to the specification, to the elicitation than to the specification, but also close to the specification. During the elicitation, we gather the needs and the requirements. Now that we have those requirements, we can analyze and negotiate them in order to create a specification afterward. Okay, so as you can see, they are really tied together, those three activities. So we will be covering all of them. Requirements modeling. As I mentioned, probably the most common technique during the requirements analysis for analyzing the requirements is the modeling. Okay, take into account that the main purpose of the activity of the analysis is to understand the requirement. Okay, for understanding those requirements, what we should do? Well, just start talking with the different stakeholders and make sure that we are understanding what they are asking for. But also we can just use this technique, which is the modeling, in order to be sure that we are just understanding something properly. Someone is going to tell us what the system is going to do, or what their needs are, and we can just create a model of that and just show the model to that person and say, okay, this is what you are asking for, or this is how you are doing things right now. And that model is going to be really helpful, because based on that model, of course, if the person we are talking with understands the modeling technique we are using, he can say, okay, that is exactly what we are doing, or that is not. You haven't understand what I have told you, or whatever. So that's the importance of a model. What's a model exactly? It's an abstraction of some aspect of an existing or planned system. Okay. So just an Another definition could be that are just a way of representing part of an entity or a system being studied in order to reduce its complexity. As we can see in this slide, we create models to serve particular purposes. For example, to present a human understandable description of some aspect of a system, or to present information in a form that can be mechanically analyzed. Okay, so there are different techniques for modeling, and with each one we are going to get different results. There are models that focus more in the information that is being exchanged between different entities that are going to be part of my system. Or there are also models that focus not that in the information being exchanged but those entities, but in the features that my system is going to offer, is going to provide. Depending exactly of we are looking for, we will be using one or another technique for modeling. Okay. Take into account that I'm not entering in detail in the different modeling techniques in this webinar. I will be mentioning a bit about use cases, for example. I did that also in the previous webinar, but I won't be explaining the use case techniques in here. For that, I will need to use probably a complete, not just a webinar, but a series of webinars for talking about use cases, okay, or other modeling techniques. So I will try just to not go too much in detail for that. Another thing that we have to take into account is that models are usually mistaken for, important wording here, for only documentation artifacts. Of course, it's legit. We are going to use models for documenting things, but they are not just a documentation tool. Probably the most important use that we can assign to models are as analysis artifact. Okay, but we can use models also for gathering the requirements. That's another reason for putting together the analysis and the elicitation, because usually we can use the models or different use cases, different business cases that we can represent with stakeholders in order to gather requirements. But also then we can use for documenting those requirements, of course. But it's not just for documenting, okay? It's important that we can use modeling also for gathering requirements, for eliciting requirement, and for analyzing requirement. Excuse me. So model is an essential task when we are, as I mentioned, specifying or analyzing requirement. We are going to use the model for map elements obtained by elicitation to a more precise or formal form. Okay. Basically, they are going to help to better understand the problem. They're going to help us to find what is missing or need further discussion. By means of these models, it's really easy to see, okay, you are missing this or you are missing that, so let's focus on this point, let's focus on this other point. As I mentioned, there are different modeling techniques, modeling languages, that we can categorize in different formalities, for example. So more informal, the most informal one will be the natural language. Okay, we just write down what the user is telling us, what the stakeholder is telling us. We can go to a more functional modeling using techniques like UML or SysML, for example, use cases or activity diagrams or domain diagrams. Okay, this is specifically use cases and domain diagrams are really common when gathering and eliciting requirement. Is a really common technique for that, but there are much more techniques, as you can see here. Domain modeling also, it's also part of the UML, but can be addressed as a different techniques. Some other techniques, as I mentioned before, I don't want to enter in each one of them. Well, I would like to enter in explaining each one of them, but we have got just 1 hour for today's webinar, and if I focus into modeling, I will need more than that just for describing each one of these models. So I'm not going to just go in detail for those models. Okay, just take into account that there are different techniques we will be mentioning also during the specification or during the validation, some of those models, in the same way that we have already talked about use cases during the requirements elicitation, but I'm not going to go in detail with them. Okay, and that's about the requirements analysis. I know that it's been really short just like 5-7 slides to cover that activity. But the important thing is that I don't want to go, as I mentioned, too much in detail in the modeling, which will be what allow me to explain more about the analysis. And basically, the analysis about understanding those requirements with techniques like the modeling. Okay, so I want just to move forward to the next activity, which is going to be the requirement specification. In this case, the requirement specification, it's really, well, all of the techniques, of course, all of the activities for the requirements engineering are important, but the requirement specification, precisely, it's a huge part of the requirements engineering. It's so big, in fact, that I'm going to talk a bit today about the requirement specification, but I am not going to finish with all of the requirement specification that I want to discuss. I will be just introducing this activity. We will be saying something about it, but there will be a whole webinar based in the requirement specification, which is going to be the third chapter of this series. Okay. Today I'm going to cover a bit about this specification, about classifying into functional and non-functional, into some techniques for writing the requirements, but in a more general point of view, not going too much in detail. For that, we will have a separate webinar. Okay. So, requirement specification, that is sometimes called requirements documentation, and it's of course called that way because that is what requirement specification is all about. It's about documenting and writing down the requirement that we have gathered in previous steps. Okay, we can just define the requirement specification as the process of documenting the user needs and constraints clearly and precisely. Okay, so as it's saying here in the slide, it's about writing clear stuff. Okay, we have gathered the requirements, we have analyzed the requirements, and now that we have understand those requirements, we have understand those needs, we are going to present those requirements or the solution depending on the level of detail we are writing. If we are writing user requirement or system requirement, we are write down now what we have properly understood. Okay, so let's write down that down formally. Okay. Basically, it's the process of documenting the user needs and constraints clearly and precisely. I've already told this. So let's say that as important as gathering and understanding the requirement is that each user or each person that is going to work with the requirement understand the same by reading those requirements. So we have to be really, really clear with those requirements. We have to write the requirement in a way that doesn't matter who read those requirements is going to understand exactly the same. Okay. Here you can see an example of a sentence that it's probably not so easy to understand. Okay, so that's something very common when writing down the requirement, when reading the requirement. The first thing that I want to discuss more in detail when working with the requirement specification is the classification between functional and non-functional requirement. Okay, we have already mentioned, we have already discussed what is a user requirement, what's a system requirement, what are the main difference between them, how the user requirements are used for gathering. They are more close to the problem, more close to the user needs, and how the system requirements are more close to the solution, proposal of a solution for those needs, for those user requirements. Okay, we also can categorize the requirement in another way, in another category, which is classifying them into functional and non-functional. A functional requirement describes what the system must do. Okay, just as simple as that. For example, the system shall provide a list of connected users. Okay, that's a functional requirement because it's explaining or it's describing what the system must do. The non-functional requirement, on the other hand, are going to express limitation or constraints to what the system must do. Okay, so the system shall provide a list of connected user, that's fine. That's a functional requirement. But then the system shall work on both Linux and Windows platform. Linux and Windows platform. Okay, that is not describing what the system must do. It's just expressing some limitation in the way it shall be done. Okay, so providing a list of connected users is what the system is going to do, but doing that in both Linux and Windows is just a restriction, a constraint to that. Okay, so that's the main difference between functional and non-functional requirement. It's usually a good practice to classify the requirements in these two categories because it allows us to differentiate between the system functionalities and the system constraints. Okay, allow us to focus with the functional requirement. We can focus on what the system must do, and with the non-functional restrictions to that features. Okay. Anyway, and this is super important, take into account that non-functional requirements are not what the system must do, but they are as important as the functional requirement. It's super important. If the system provides a list of connected users, that's fine, but it took like 2 hours to produce that list, and it's a real-time system that I need to get that list, I don't know, maybe once in a while, every 5 minutes, something like that. If it took 2 hours to produce the list, I'm not going to be able to use the system at all. So as important as the functional requirement are the non-functional. Don't mistake non-functional requirement for not important. Okay, they are as important as the functional one. And another important thing to do is just trace the functional requirement with the non-functional requirement. Okay, as we mentioned, the non-functional usually restrict the functional, so it's important to understand which non-functional are restricting which functional requirement. Okay, so it's important to divide those two concepts, to classify them in order to focus into the different aspects of the system, but it's also important to understand exactly how they work together. So I need to know exactly which requirement is restricting which other requirements. Okay. Usually, a non-functional requirement is traced with one or several functional requirements. In the example that I have listed in here, it's pretty easy to understand the functional requirement and the non-functional requirement. But sometimes it's not so easy to differentiate a functional from a non-functional requirement. Should we spend hours or days just discussing if this is functional or non-functional? Probably not. Okay, it's important to classify them, but don't spend days, don't waste days just discussing is this functional, is this non-functional. Okay, try to classify them, but of course with keeping in mind what is important. Okay, because sometimes it's not so easy to understand if it's functional or if it's not functional. Regarding the traceability, okay, we have mentioned about the user and system requirement, and we have mentioned about the functional and non-functional requirement. So we can have user requirements that can be functional requirement and user requirements that can be non-functional, and in the same way, system requirements that are functional and system requirements that are non-functional. How they are going to be traced together? Well, not only the functional in the user requirement with the functional in the system, and the non-functional in the user with the non-functional in the system. In fact, for example, a non-functional user requirement can end up being resolved by functional requirement in the system requirement domain. Okay, for example, I may have a user requirement that is that I'm going to develop a software system, and my non-functional requirement is that the system must work 24/7. Okay, it should be available all the time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and so on and so on. Okay, so that's a non-functional requirement. It's not saying anything about what the system must do, but restrictions to that. Okay, so far so good. We analyze that. That's the user request, that's the user requirement. We analyze that, and we discovered that in order to implement that, the system requirements that are going to be gathered of that user requirements are that I must perform daily backups, and I have to have a couple of backup systems. Okay, not just data backup, but also a backup system just in case the main fails, so I can just reroute whatever to that backup system. Okay, that activity of performing backups and having a backup system is a functional requirement, a functional system requirement. Okay, so in this case, I'm going to trace a non-functional requirement in the user requirement domain with a functional requirement in the system requirement domain. Okay, so take into account that usually traceability is user requirement functional with system requirement functional, user requirement non-functional with system requirement non-functional, but there are no limitations to that. Okay. Another thing regarding the non-functional requirement, it's that it's a common practice to subclassify the non-functional requirement into other categories. Like, for example, interface requirement, if they are talking about how my, well, not how, but if they are talking about my system relating with the user interface itself, or other systems, the interface with other systems. About performance, how much time I'm going to spend for doing this, about security, about the standards, about etc. Okay. Why it's important to subclassify the non-functional requirement into different categories to have my own subtypes? Well, in order to create checklist. Okay, having a list of usual suspects, let's say, allow me to, every time I elaborate on a specification, I can just say, okay, we are not, for example, we don't have any interface, user interface non-functional requirement in this specification. Yeah, because it's a system without a user interface. Okay, that's fine, no problem. But having the category allow me to have this checklist and just check that I'm not missing any of these categories. Okay. Usually when working with a requirement, having checklist for almost everything is super helpful. For the non-functional requirement, for the usual suspect stakeholders, let's say, okay, the authorized sources of requirements, things like that. Okay, having those checklists allow me to just go to the checklist and verify that I haven't forget anything. Okay, so that's a good practice when working with non-functional requirements. So, how to specify a requirement? The language we are going to use. Of course, I'm not talking about Spanish or English or Chinese. I'm talking about the formal language or the natural language that we are going to use. We have got a graphing here letting us know that the easier to understand it's the language, it's the less precise. Okay, for example, the natural language, the system shall do this. Okay, it's more or less easy to understand. Everyone can understand that without a specific knowledge. But it's less precise than, for example, a UML diagram, which is an structured language. It's harder to understand because you need to be sorry, familiar with the UML notation. You have to first study UML in order to understand that, but it's going to be more precise. The same goes for the pseudocode. It's going to be more precise, but it's going to be harder to understand. And finally, a formal specification is most precise than the pseudocode, but is harder to understand. So the harder to understand, the more precise that the language is going to be, but the easier to understand, it's less precise. So we have to write down my requirement. Which language should I use? Which language should I pick? Well, the answer for that is that the requirement must be written in a language that will be comprehended by those that will be reading the requirements. Sounds very logical, sounds very easy, but it's not always that easy. Okay, everyone that is going to read the requirement must understand the requirements. That's the reason for the user requirements being written in a language more close to the user, if possible, using the vocabulary of the user with the terms and with the concepts close to the user world. But the system requirements are going to be written in a more probably in a more precise, in a more user-free language, because the user, we can explain them to the user, but he doesn't have to work with them, the user, to the stakeholders, of course. Requirements always must be written following the formats, guidelines, and templates established by the organization of project. Okay, we will be saying more things about this afterward. These templates must be flexible because not all requirements or neither all project will fit with the same set of rules. Okay, depending on the user that are working with them, depending on their knowledge, depending on exactly what they are. It's not the same to design an airplane or to design a software, of course. Okay. The aiming of all of this is to ease the reading and the comprehension of the requirement, because at the end, that is what the requirements specification is about. It's about writing the requirement in a way that they are comprehend exactly the same, but by everyone reading the requirements. Okay, so some standards when writing down the requirement. Each requirement should or must form a complete sentence. Okay, a requirement is not a bullet, a list of buzzwords, a list of acronyms or sounds. It's not a cell in a table. It's okay. The requirement should be a short sentence and a complete sentence. Okay, each requirement must contain a subject, for example, the user type or the system, and then a predicate, which is going to be the condition, the action that is intended as a result of the requirement. Okay. The verb, and this is important, especially when writing the requirements in English, it's super important to distinguish between shall, will, must, which is mandatory nature, may, should, can be used for describing optional nature. So we have a more detailed list here. For example, must, require, or shall mean that the definition is an absolute requirement of the specification. Must not or shall not, it's an absolute prohibition. Should or recommend, think twice about not doing it, but it's not so mandatory. Should not or not recommended, think twice about doing that. May or optional are really truly optional. The system optionally can, whatever, that is really truly optional. This is just some rules of thumbs, okay, some guidelines when working with the requirements, okay. The whole requirement must provide the specific of a desired end, goal, and results. Okay, so the requirement must be self-explanatory with all that. And should contain a success criterion or other measurable indication of the quality, because if not, we won't be able to measure at the end if the requirement has been properly implemented or not. Okay, we will be talking about this in the next webinar more in detail, but if I say something like the system must work 24/7 for 100 years, for example, there is no way for testing that. Okay, so I must add some criteria for testing. Okay, maybe I can use some testing tools that are going to test the system in case of failure or whatever, but saying it's going to work for 100 years is not possible, because then I will have to it's not possible to measure, because I will have to be running a test for 100 years. Okay. Usually always try to write short sentence, use the active voice in order to identify the subject, identify who is going to perform the action. It's also important to know whether your requirement is explicit enough. So for that, read the requirement from the developer point of view. Imagine that you are going to develop the requirement. It's with the information you are writing down is enough for you to develop the requirement. You're going to understand everything that you need. And then also for the tester point of view, with this information, I will be able to test the requirement, like the example of the 100 years. Okay. The granularity, write the requirement that can be unitary tested. For that, avoid using an or statement that compose multiple requirements. The system shall manage user and provide reports. Those are clearly two separate requirements. One is for managing user, one is for providing reports. Okay, so write two separate requirements. Don't use an or to put two requirements together, because that is going to be complicated to test. It's going to be complicated to trace. We will be talking about that in the third chapter of the webinars. Okay. Keep an homogeneous and consistent level of details for all the requirements. and avoid redundancies, may ease the reading but not the maintenance, and may lead to inconsistencies. This is hard to do, but we are not writing a novel. It shouldn't be funny to read. It must be clear and precise. Okay, so the whole specification could be a bit, let's say, boring to read because it's the system shall, the system shall, the system shall, the system may, the system must. But that's what it is. It's not a novel. We are not writing a bestseller. We are writing a specification that must be easy to understand and easy to read. Okay. So those are just some advice from the writing quality requirement from Carl Biggers. Finally, template for requirement. There is no such thing as a standard template when working with the requirement. Each organization or project must pick their own way. But some examples for writing the requirements are, for example, the years template, which says add some optional preconditions. When these happen, if this happen, whatever, optional trigger, and also this condition, whatever, then the system name, the word processors or the email client or whatever shall, and the system responds to this. Okay, that's a template for writing the requirements. For system requirement, a more simplified template. The system shall do whatever. Okay, we have the IEEE specification for templates. For a document template, letting us know exactly the different chapters that we must use, the scope, the functional, the non-functional requirements, and so on and so on. Here you have got a screenshot of a use case template extract from the Alistair Cockburn book for writing use cases, with, not just for the requirement, but also for the use cases. We can have templates for the precondition, postconditions, triggers, steps, and so on. And here we have got a different example of the NASA terminology. As you can see, they have categorized each verb that you are going to use. If you use shall, it's because of this. If you use must, it's because of that. Are applicable, is required, will, should, whatever. This is super formal, but it's also we have to also be super careful because, and there are some initiative in this direction that allow me to even prioritize the requirement based on the verb that I am using. Because if optional, if I say may, if mandatory, if I say must or shall, and so on. But that means that I must be consistent and always use shall when I when I must use shall, not just say suddenly may if it should be a shall. Okay. So this is just an example of a formal way to just use the different verbs. So there is much more to talk about the specification. There are certain rules that we should follow when writing the requirements for avoid ambiguity, for helping traceability, for making it easier to read, easier to understand. But I won't be covering them today. As I mentioned, we will be covering them in the next webinar, which will be all about requirement specification. We will be refreshing some of the things that we have seen here, but we'll be focusing mainly in the specification, the part that we have not covered here today. So what we have seen today is that if the requirement specification was about gathering the requirements analysis is about understanding those requirements, usually by the means of models. We have to be sure that we are going to specify much the stakeholder needs. Okay, and for that we have to understand properly the requirements. After the analysis, we go to the specification, which is about writing the requirements once we have properly understood them. We have understood them in the analysis step. For that, is as important as understanding the requirement is that everyone that reads the requirement is going to understand the same thing. So take that into account. We may have to spend a bit of extra time for writing the requirement, but it's important to expend that time in order to save time in the future for the people that is going to read them. Using pattern for writing the requirement is recommended, or templates, and also using pattern for the document themselves, not just for the requirement, but for the whole document. And remember, this is really important, We are going to write the requirements once, but we are going to read the requirement thousands of times. So let's spend some extra time writing those requirements in order to make sure that we are going to easy the reading of those requirements. Okay, so that's the summary for today. That's basically what we have been watching in today's webinar. As I mentioned before, we will be continuing with the series of webinar in the next chapter, which is going to be about requirements specification. We have seen a bit today, but we will be covering that much more in detail. Now we are going to move forward to the last part of the webinar, which is going to be the question and answer section. But before going to that section, I'm going to stop the recording, and I'm going to thank you, all of you, for your attention. And just remember that we will be uploading this webinar to the different medias, YouTube, Vimeo, whatever, to make it available for all of you. And we will be also notifying all of you with our next chapter. I would like to thank you, everyone that is watching this video on YouTube now, and just say goodbye to them, because I'm going to stop recording and switch to the question and answer section. Goodbye.